Against legal advice, Christian reaches out to Andrea on May 19th, 2019. He'd seen she was dating someone new, and he wanted to try to mend some wounds left from their breakup conversation nearly 3 months earlier. He texts, "I'm going to tell you what happened that night."
I was just sitting on the couch watching TV. I was going to go outside and smoke. I smoked cigarettes at the time. And I was holding Storm. I had just been eating high chews, which is it's a candy. And I didn't realize this, but she had a little wrapper in her mouth. She was just chewing on it, so I tried to take it out of her mouth, and I had to reach kind of far in her throat, and she bit the inside of my hands. I had a picture of it. I sent it to my dad. I don't know if you guys ever saw that. I pulled back as she got scared and jumped away from me. And the railing is pretty wide at that old apartment complex, so she thought she could land on it safely, and she probably could have, but it's also curved and really slippery, and she slid right off. She fell 3 stories, and I remembered hearing a metal thud, and immediately I ran down. Didn't take me very long to find her. She was just curled up and whimpering a little bit under a tree that was really close. I think she hit one of the air conditioning fans that was right outside the apartment. And I think that's what the metal noise was. And I didn't notice anything at first, so I took her all the way back up. And whenever I started looking at her face, I noticed that it looked like her eye was bleeding. So I went to get a paper towel, and I got some water on it, and I started dabbing at the eye, and I realized the blood wasn't coming off. I saw it was coming from inside the eye.
You're listening to Vulnerable Creatures. I'm Lauren Hugg.
And I'm Matthew Schnipper. This is episode 4, Free Falling. Christian didn't give as much detail to Andrea as he told us in the clip you just heard. He simply texted her, "Storm fell off the balcony."
When an investigator for the DA's office interviews Andrea a few weeks later regarding new information in the case, she turns Christian's text over to him. The investigator notes the defendant told her that the cat, quote, unquote, fell off the 3rd floor balcony, and that was going to be his story in court.
From that note, it appears the DA's office investigator and Andrea don't believe that's what actually happened.
So is Christian's version of events true?
There's no way to know for certain, but the story Christian told us and Andrea is consistent, detail by detail, with what he told his family, private investigator Zook, and his attorney. It's also consistent with what he told Ron Apgar, the independent therapist who conducted the statutorily required animal cruelty evaluation of Christian in September of 2019.
In Christian's case, the therapist conducted an anger assessment to see if he had anger issues, and a psychopathological assessment to provide information on personality disorders, mood disorders, substance abuse problems, and antisocial behaviors.
Apgar's report states,
Mr. Breuer's anger profile indicates that Mr. Breuer does not have a predisposition for aggressive or violent behavior, nor is he easily provoked, and does not have an inclination to hit someone or break things. It is possible that Mr. Breuer's responses were misinterpreted within the communication nuances of intense fear and anxiety.
Apgar also writes that Christian
adamantly denied intentionally or forcefully reacting toward the cat by jerking and throwing the cat, causing the cat to fall off the deck.
While Apgar's evaluation sheds light on Christian's perspective, the assessments he performed aren't entirely appropriate for evaluating an individual with autism, or really anyone accused of animal cruelty.
Those kinds of tests probably aren't sensitive enough or maybe entirely inappropriate for that individual.
That's Dr. Phil Tedeschi, then executive director at University of Denver's Institute for Human-Animal Connection, who we heard from in the last episode.
So then you're likely to have information that gets kind of distorted at best, right? And then utilized in these kind of cumbersome and sometimes pretty abusive ways, as though we have some individual who's, inevitably going to harm people. This misinformation, almost kind of inappropriate and often not very scientific use of that concept of the link.
Tedeschi and his colleagues developed a comprehensive and individualized assessment specifically for animal cruelty cases called a forensic animal maltreatment evaluation. It has more than 60 items that can help distinguish specific indicators to determine culpability. It takes into consideration things like the characteristics of the animal victim, personal and family history, criminal history, specifics of the abuse, and purpose of the abuse.
For example, was the abuse intended to control, coerce, or intimidate another human being? Or is something else at play?
The Colorado Animal Cruelty Statute doesn't make clear what type of evaluation is required by law. Christian underwent anger and psychopathological assessments. Tedeschi gives an example of why an animal cruelty-specific assessment should be used instead.
And I've had cases where the harm done to the animal, the criminal charge directed at the animal cruelty, can look identical. So for one example that comes to mind is 2 cases I evaluated where they both injured about 12 rabbits, baby rabbits. And in one case, it was an individual who had a much more criminogenic focus threw these rabbits against the house, and they were his neighbor's rabbits. And the other was an individual who was kind of an emerging kind of schizoaffective, who also killed 11 rabbits of his sisters by throwing them in the air and trying to catch them. If you looked at the crime itself, you would assume that it's almost the same offender. When you look at their clinical profile, the older kid, who was the kid with this emerging kind of schizotypal presentation, had almost no criminogenic factors, really needed to have a medication evaluation, needed to be monitored for mental health related issues. The other kid, on the other hand, had almost all the criminogenic factors and none of the other factors, right? And so if you were designing a treatment plan for those 2 kids, or even a dispositional plan for those individuals, they would look totally different, but often they're treated as the same crime.
That's why an evaluation with multiple factors specifically related to animal cruelty is so important.
And we never want to use just one indicator to make our decisions. We want to use the comprehensive knowledge about how that individual's functioning in their life in school and work and relationships and those sorts of things. We wouldn't scare somebody into believing it's a domestic violence case unless we had other corroborating clinical relevance to believe that human security was jeopardized. Besides that, and these are the kinds of outcomes when I think people just overreact.
So, what if injuries to an animal are the result of poor impulse control or lack of understanding of how to properly handle animals, and not a pattern of exercising control and power to terrorize someone, as we heard about in the last episode?
When I first started doing this work 35 years ago, we just assumed everybody was a power and control batterer, right? And that's just not true.
That's domestic violence prevention expert Janet Kerr.
What if this case isn't about domestic abuse or animal abuse at all, but is a tragic accident followed by some poor decision-making by Christian and taking a wait-and-see approach about getting Storm to the vet and telling Andrea he didn't know what happened?
That depends on whether Storm's injuries could plausibly be caused by Christian's explanation about her falling off the balcony. Could they?
Yes. Cats so regularly fall from high places that you can buy pet insurance covering high-rise syndrome, a term referring to the injuries that cats can sustain when they fall from a steep height, such as out of a window, down a fire escape, or when they miss a jump. It's so common that even WebMD has articles addressing it. The article we found notes how cats have little fear of heights and enjoy perching in high places. Though they can cling to the bark of trees with their claws, man-made surfaces are much more difficult. So yeah, metal porch railing, not so much. When a cat falls, says the article, they flip over to land on their feet, and in the process, they splay their legs slightly to better absorb the fall's impact. But that can lead to head and pelvis injuries if they fall far enough.
Injuries like the ones Storm sustained. Blunt force trauma.
Check.
Soft tissue damage to Storm's right front limb.
Check. It's a misconception that cats won't be injured if they only fall from 1 or 2 stories. They may actually be at a greater risk for injury when falling shorter distances because they don't have enough time to adjust their body posture to fall correctly. When cats have a longer time to adjust themselves during a fall, They instinctively parachute, like flying squirrels, although not quite as effectively. We've found articles detailing cats that have survived falls as high as 32 stories.
All the vets who treated Storm agree that a fall from a third-story balcony could have caused Storm's injuries. When asked by Zook, the PI, if Christian's versions of events was plausible, Dr. Ayler said,
"That would totally be consistent with the kitten's injuries. It's common for cats to fall from a height and hit their heads, causing trauma. It most definitely could have happened that way."
Dr. Cordy said,
"Certainly, that is a possibility."
Dr. Walker said,
"It's possible the injuries could have happened like your client says."
But she's also all over the place. She acknowledges she had no first-hand information as to how the injuries occurred because she didn't see Storm until a week after the incident. But that doesn't stop her from stating an opinion.
"It seems to me he's covering something up. I can't say 100% that the kitten would not have sustained those injuries from that kind of fall, but I don't believe that the injuries are consistent with that. That guy needs anger management. It's like he threw the kitten like a football into a wall."
Whoa. There is zero evidence that Christian threw Storm against a wall. Apgar, the therapist, determined Christian does not have an inclination to hit someone or break things. Apgar even says Christian's explanation was plausible. But questions remain because he didn't give that explanation to Andrea.
Christian has a reason for that. In his own words to her from the text he sent on May 19, 2019, he says, "I was scared to tell you because I thought you would react harshly, which is not far off."
He wasn't wrong. Andrea cut off contact with him and left her entire life in the wake of Storm's injuries.
Christian told us how he felt after Storm fell.
Shaky and nervous, and I felt bad because, if I hadn't gone out to smoke, that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't holding her on the balcony, But I was horrified because I knew that if I told her, it was because, I brought her out there, and she really hated it when I smoked. She really hated it.
As we heard last episode, Christian didn't like what he perceived as Andrea's random outbursts of anger over trivial things he couldn't guess would be a problem. Here he knew Andrea didn't want him taking Storm out on the balcony and hated him smoking. In his mind, an outburst of anger from Andrea was guaranteed if he told her what happened.
He told us about times when he would try to get away from an argument, but Andrea would insist on following him and continuing it.
If I disengage, people, they don't like that. They don't like that behavior. It's not like every time somebody gets in an argument with me, I can just, pull out I have Asperger's card and be like, just let me do my own thing. It would make it easier if I could do that, but I feel guilty, I guess. So I try to handle problems like most people do, because they appreciate that more.
But he didn't just fear an angry outburst. He knew Andrea doted on Storm. He didn't want to disappoint the woman he loved.
We haven't talked about that much. We've been so focused on all the contradictions in this case that we haven't spent a lot of time on the fact that it resulted in the end of a 4-year relationship between two young people in love. A couple who had recently moved in together and were in the process of planning their wedding. They'd been engaged for 3 years. Christian tells us he proposed in high school.
She talked about getting married and stuff. She definitely wanted to get married. She was in the Rotary Club and she was going to Denmark. Before she left, we'd been with each other for about a year, and I really liked her, so I was like, all right, I'm gonna do this. I learned all about wedding rings because I knew exactly what she wanted. It was a solitaire ring, white gold.
Christian found a way to work engagement rings into conversations with her friends during lunch and convinced Andrea to measure her finger with a ring sizing kit his parents had.
We wondered if his parents were supportive of him proposing at such a young age. They were high school sweethearts themselves.
I told them it was a promise ring. I told them later that I had actually proposed. They were excited but serious because I was very young.
Christian spent $500 on the ring.
And I used some of my, savings at the time that my parents had built up for me, and they let me use a little bit of it, and then I used a little bit of my own money just from the birthdays and Christmas. I didn't have a job at the time. I took her to this lake that we used to go to. I set my phone up on a bench and proposed at sunset after a dinner date. nice. I made it like a complete surprise. She ran up and grabbed the ring without even hesitating. I think she just ran up and grabbed it and started freaking out.
They'd planned to be married sometime in 2019, around the anniversary of when they first started dating, September 12th, says Christian. The move-in together was a big step towards this. Christian tells us he considered Andrea his best friend up until Storm was injured.
All right, so Christian both loved and feared Andrea and was afraid of her reaction if he told her what happened to Storm. But why did he lie to Andrea and say he didn't know what happened, when actually he did?
I do not remember exactly what I told her. I know that it wasn't the truth. Right then, I just was, really scared of having to fight. I didn't even think that it would come to this. The law enforcement and stuff never even entered my mind. I was just self-preservation, everybody will be okay here. We'll just get her to the vet, and then, I don't have to be shouted at and get in a fight over this. We can just take her and, pay for it, and everything will be okay, and then it'll be over.
Christian says he was completely panicking.
I, was scared for the cat. I was scared for Storm. I was scared for how much it was going to cost. I was scared about how angry AJ was going to be. It was just a very big adrenaline rush.
AJ, by the way, is what he calls Andrea. From what we've heard, she tended to call him Chris.
It was just a perfect storm for me, just not wanting to deal with whatever was going to happen with that and not realizing how big of a consequence that would have.
So he lied. He's not denying that. Even his mom, Shannon, tells us he lied to Andrea.
But his parents also say it's quite common for him to be extremely guarded and self-protective. It's just one way autism manifests for him.
Still, his credibility in this whole story must be weighed against the fact that he lied. It's only fair to ask what else that he tells us can be wholly believed, because it all starts on the foundation of a lie.
I don't see it that way. A lie would be placing blame on someone else, or giving some alternative explanation. Saying, I don't know, is a coping mechanism. As Christian said, he was trying to avoid getting shouted at, making an already stressful situation even more overwhelming. His kitten is injured, and although he didn't mean to hurt Storm, he still feels guilty because he was doing something Andrea didn't want him to do.
Smoking and taking Storm out into the balcony.
Right. He's afraid of how Andrea's going to react. He's worried about money, and don't forget, he also has a paper due that night and is supposed to leave town the next day. That's a lot of stimuli to manage. As Christian's mom, Shannon, told us,
it's just hard for him to realize in a moment, okay, this is what I need to do right now to deal with this that's going on. That process is just difficult for him.
To better understand how autism impacts Christian's response, we talked to Dr. Laurie Sperry, an expert with over 35 years in the field of autism, including experience in autism forensics.
So he was asked what happened to the cat, and he responded, I don't know. In general, there may be phrases that he has learned over the course of his life that truncate an odious situation. It's based on the principle of negative reinforcement. Let me give you an example. I have a teenage son, so I want him to empty the dishwasher. And so I nag for him to empty the dishwasher. And he empties the dishwasher, and I stop nagging. So his dishwasher emptying behavior is reinforced by my withdrawal of an aversive stimulus, which is the nagging. So she's asking him, what happened to the cat? What happened to the cat? Oh my God, what happened to the cat? Or however that went down. And he has this phrase, perhaps, that he has used that over the course of his lifetime has resulted in the removal of an aversive stimulus, which is the questioning about something that's stressful to him. So for him, it may have been, I don't want to talk about this right now, or I'm stressed out, or whatever, became, I don't know. just saying I don't know is like a pass, but it doesn't give the listener enough information. And in this situation, the listener saw it as evasiveness or trying to cover up a crime.
While Andrea was aware Christian is autistic, she didn't appear to have a thorough understanding of how it impacts his life, and would have no way of knowing he meant, "I'm too stressed to talk about this right now," when he said he didn't know what happened to Storm.
As Christian tells Andrea in a text sent in mid-February 2019, in the midst of his legal case, "This is something I've never talked to you about. You and I both have much different tolerances of stress, and honestly, mine is much lower. I was trying to work hard on things I didn't even know how to do. I would get really stressed out. I knew you were stressed too, but you seem to be able to power through that better than I can." This might be a good time to explain a bit more about autism generally, because as we'll see, it's misunderstood by a lot of people involved in this case.
We talked to Jennifer Paz-Ryan and Dr. Kate Colon, licensed clinical psychologists who are co-founders of Elevated Insights Assessment, a Denver-based psychological and educational assessment practice. We asked them to define autism. They referred to something called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, for the clinical definition.
It would literally be deficits in social communication and a pattern of restricted and repetitive behaviors that impact functioning across environments that must be present from early development. The key piece is that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder.
She says this involves genetically influenced differences in brain development.
There's so many things that come with autism that if you really funnel them the right way, can be very advantageous. But it depends on the person in terms of this idea of disability, right? You have to look at, well, what is getting in my way? How is this preventing me from functioning in the most optimal way in my everyday life?
We also asked the doctors to explain Asperger's, since that's how Christian identifies.
Traditionally, people consider an individual that Asperger's might be someone you consider to be, could be someone that's highly intelligent. On some levels, is considered high functioning, which the terms high functioning and low functioning, people are moving away from those terms now because of the stigma that's attached to them, and that it doesn't necessarily capture certain aspects. So someone could be considered, having Asperger's, can be really highly intelligent, but the deficits in some of these areas are also so profound that it doesn't necessarily capture what's difficult for them. Really, there's been a shift to move away from high functioning and low functioning and to talk about how much support an individual is in need of.
I've mentioned before that my child is autistic, but I learned so much from the conversation with these doctors. I've made a conscious effort to avoid using the terms high and low functioning ever since hearing from them. As Dr. Colon points out, the language we use impacts our perceptions and approaches.
The idea behind Asperger's is that highly intelligent, but it could be in just like one area or not across the board, or could be across the board. We also see people who are highly gifted, but that piece of having that neurodevelopmental disorder, they could be highly gifted, and that's where people are like, I just don't understand because they can't pay their rent or figure out how to manage time or keep a job or have a relationship. People don't really understand the real discrepant deficits that exist. Just because their intelligence says that they should be able to doesn't mean that they can. And that's where that neurodevelopmental piece comes in. And that's what is so hard for people to wrap their head around. That's why it's a spectrum, because there's these subtle differences and everyone presents so differently and has different areas of strength and weaknesses. It's so individualized. It's like a fingerprint, like a shadow.
Christian's mom, Shannon, who also happens to have a master's degree in child development and child psychology, and holds extensive work history inside every level of schooling from pre-K through 12th grade, told us about ways she's witnessed autism impacting Christian's life.
He doesn't have all of those coping mechanisms, that tend to come naturally to, the neurotypical group. He has to learn ways of coping and dealing with things, and it's really hard to impart those things. He's been through a ton of therapy. He is fairly independent now, other than financially, but still I think he's always going to need my help. He needs it with everything from school to work to stress management to someone to just talk him down when he's over anxious about things, or when he doesn't know what to do, or when he's angry or gets upset, or when he's just emotionally triggered. He's just always going to need me, even when he's married, even when he has kids. He's just going to need that person who understands how to approach him and how to help him navigate everything he's going through. And it's not that I know all the answers, it's just that I know him. Most people, the majority of people, don't understand the way someone with autism processes information. They just don't understand. So, you give a bunch of information to Christian, you can tell him a ton of information, and at the end he'll say, okay. And you say, do you understand? Yeah. And he doesn't understand. But he's saying yes because so much about his life has been trying to look normal. What can I do and say so that I appear normal and I don't get judged and no one looks at me like I'm, in Christian's words, sometimes he says retarded. And I'm like, buddy, you are not retarded. This is not, that's apples and oranges, but he feels so different internally. He feels like he is less than. And I'm always having to tell him, I'm like, you're actually exceptional. You don't get it. You're exceptional.
I empathize with everything she just said. On the one hand, your child has challenges and you want to be there to support them through those. On the other hand, you see how exceptional your child is, how much they deal with, and how well they manage it most of the time. And you wish the whole world understood how much we expect of autistic individuals. Rather than try to understand them, their perspectives, experiences, and preferences, we demand they do things our way, and then get frustrated with them the relatively small percentage of the time when they just can't do it. In talking to Christian, his concern for the feelings and perceptions of others jumped out at me.
Right. Like how he told us he tries not to withdraw from arguments, even though that's his preference and coping mechanism, because most people don't like it when he does that.
Or his response when we asked his preference regarding autism terminology.
He told us his preference is that people say what they're most comfortable with. He doesn't want them to feel like they're walking on eggshells when the topic of autism comes up.
He knows he doesn't fit in. Like a tall person who's always stooping to make themselves smaller, Christian's perpetually apologizing and trying to meet the expectations of others.
Regarding members of the autism community, Leanne Paskevich, executive director of the Autism Society of Colorado, told us that
some people believe that they're more empathetic and they're more of a sponge to how people are thinking and talking and feeling around them. And so that's another thing that they need to recognize, but we also need to recognize. What the disconnect is they don't portray empathy in the way that is socially normed, like maybe comforting someone or checking in or asking if they're okay, because they may feel it and have the empathy, but they might not know how to act on it in a socially appropriate way, or they might be afraid, but it doesn't mean that they don't feel it. And I think there are some people who feel it so strongly that it's actually sensory offensive. The empathy piece is so strong in them that it becomes overwhelming.
A lot of research has been conducted into the ways autistic adults are vulnerable due to differences in communication and cognition style. Dr. Paz Ryan told us her practice doesn't assess a ton of adults, but when it does, there's often a long record of complex societal challenges.
There is this history of being violated, manipulated, being used. There's usually history of sexual abuse or jail time, like some kind of detainment, some kind of trouble that has been the catalyst.
A 2020 study published in the Autism and Adulthood Journal examined the chronic exhaustion, loss of skills, and reduced tolerance to stimulus experienced by autistic adults because of life stressors, barriers to support, and lack of empathy from neurotypical people. Participants in this study described negative impacts on their health, capacity for independent living, and quality of life, including suicidal behavior. They described acceptance and social support, time off, reduced expectations, and doing things in an autistic way, the way that is natural to them rather than the neurotypical people in their lives, as helpful in recovering from autistic burnout.
Those are the things Christian told Andrea were frustrations for him in their relationship. He needed more time alone. He didn't feel accepted by her because he felt like she was always trying to change him. And he described how stressed and overwhelmed he felt generally in that text to Andrea and to us when explaining what was going through his mind when Storm was injured.
Given all that, I guess I can understand why he told Andrea he didn't know what happened to Storm right when she got home. But several days later, she asks him again via text if he knows what happened to the kitten. And he replies, "I obviously don't, and I don't like what you're insinuating. It doesn't make sense to me either, and I wish I could know what the hell happened, but there's just no way we can find out." Now that's not a learned response to remove an adverse stimuli. That's a deliberate lie.
Sure, but fear is still a factor here. Christian still wants to avoid an argument. For what it's worth, he told us,
I was a much different person back then. I think I hold honesty a bit higher now in terms of things that I care about and try to practice. I mean, this whole thing led me to a very long self-help journey of, trying to improve myself. Back then, that was the easy way out, and I had no problem with that.
Regardless of the reasoning behind it, Christian's lie will go on to haunt him and color how everyone else who touches this case perceives him. It factors into how he and his parents and the attorneys approach legal decisions.
Another big factor in this case is Christian not getting vet care for Storm. One of the misdemeanor cruelty charges was failure to seek care.
In Christian's mind, he was caring for Storm by Googling cat eye bleeding internally to see what he was supposed to do.
I was looking to see whether or not I needed to take her to a vet. There was a whole bunch of conflicting statements of whether or not she needed to be taken to the vet, whether or not it was life-threatening or anything like that.
Can Christian be believed about this?
Well, we spoke with Dr. Temple Grandin, author, animal welfare consultant, and professor of animal science at Colorado State University. There's a school that serves neurodivergent students with autism spectrum disorder named in her honor and based on her educational experiences in Boulder, Colorado.
You may have heard of her. Grandin, who is autistic, is internationally renowned, thanks in part to a 2010 HBO film about her life, starring Claire Danes, which won 7 Emmys. We're going to hear more from her in a future episode, but for now, something she told us during our interview may help answer this question. Dr. Grandin told us,
one of the things is that a person with autism takes longer to process. I thought one time I was having a stroke. I went right to YouTube. I wasn't sure whether I should call 911. I actually spent 10 minutes on YouTube, and I found out I was not having a stroke. There's a lot of emergencies where you're not sure what to do.
So it's certainly plausible that Christian would have turned to the internet to help him make sense of the situation. Christian believes he didn't fail to seek care because he proactively searched for information online and found evidence sufficient to suggest a wait-and-see approach.
Dr. Cordy seems to agree, telling Zook, the PI, that
oftentimes people don't realize the seriousness of an injury. I understand that pet owners often hope that the animal will get over it. Of course, money is an issue.
We've already heard that Christian was super concerned about money, that it's something he and Andrea would argue about. Remember, Andrea even told Corporal Cheney that Christian gets upset about money.
She had just started working at a hospital, so she was getting $22 an hour, and I was getting $12 an hour at a cafe, so it wasn't as easy for me to pay for things.
And it's not like Christian did nothing to help Storm for a whole day, as ALE Assistant Director Vinya and Corporal Cheney seem to assume.
So I did everything I could, and about 15 minutes later, while I was looking at her on the couch, AJ got home.
According to what Andrea told Corporal Cheney, that was at 7:20 p.m. Storm was checked into the pet ER at 8:23 p.m. If Christian's story and timeline is true, Storm received medical treatment within an hour and 20 minutes. Does that sound like it warrants a failure to seek care charge?
Let's not forget, Andrea didn't know what to do either initially. As we've heard before, she called her mom for advice, and her mom told her to take the cat to the vet right away. But Corporal Cheney perceived the fact that Christian didn't immediately take Storm himself or accompany Andrea as suspicious.
I didn't think that it was a big deal because I was reading online that this was something you could just wait out and it would be fine. But still, we both decided we should, err on the side of caution anyway and take her to the vet, which was fine by me. but she, really wanted me to go, and I, had other things to do, so I figured that it would be okay if I didn't go with her. I wish I did, because it would have, changed the trajectory of this whole thing that happened.
He's absolutely right about that. If he'd gone to the vet with Andrea, Corporal Cheney wouldn't have been able to charge him with failure to seek vet care. And by taking the kitten to the vet, he likely would have been perceived as a responsible pet owner seeking treatment for an accident.
Not an abuser trying to hide evidence of a crime.
Dr. Walker says she wouldn't even question or suspect him had he immediately taken the kitten to the hospital. She says,
I get it that he's autistic, but a normal person should have immediately taken it to the hospital.
A normal person? Wow.
An autistic individual may need more time to process, and that additional processing time is normal. It's not a sign of criminality or callousness.
Now, what may appear callous is when Christian continued on with his family trip plans and didn't stay to help Andrea out with Storm's care. But according to a November 21, 2018 text between Christian and Andrea, he begged his parents to let him stay and look after the cat, and they both lost it. We later heard from his father that Christian was hardly presented with an option. Mark called it a monumental life event for his entire family, all 8 people, because the Thanksgiving trip was concurrent with meeting Christian's biological grandfather for the first time.
Regardless of the reason, Christian's departure meant that he wasn't present for Storm's care and follow-up vet visits. And he wasn't there when Andrea's mom arrived.
Her mom was heavily involved. She immediately flew over here. She saw this as an opportunity and just got her out as quickly as she could.
You remember how Dr. Walker said that Teresa was running the show and had Andrea by the scruff of the neck? We found that corroborated by Christian's younger brother, Carter, who knew Andrea well. Carter spoke to the PI, Zook, and said that AJ always seemed very scared of her mom and complained that she tried to control her.
Her mom was genuinely one of the worst people I've ever met in my life. Regularly told her that God hates her. More emotionally abusive and manipulative than any parent I've ever seen in my life. Just a genuinely awful person. One time they caught us having sex. I was walking home because it was embarrassing. Her mom drove up next to me and was if you're gonna get in the car and come talk with us, or you're never going to see her ever again. And they yelled at me for 3 hours about how I didn't care about her and she wasn't important to me and a whole bunch of other stuff.
I would be furious if another parent yelled at my autistic kid for 3 hours without contacting me. I wish we could have heard Teresa's side of that story, but again, she declined our request for an interview.
Christian was 17 at the time, but he says Andrea's parents' dislike of him continued years later.
They treated me just absolutely horribly. They hated me for a long, long time. I tried really hard to make up with them. I tried a lot of times to prove that I was worthy.
Because of Christian's trip, Andrea was left alone with an injured kitten, a lot of vet bills, her mother's suspicion, and no answers.
Christian also wasn't present to speak to Corporal Cheney when she arrived at their apartment. But why didn't he explain everything to Cheney when she contacted him about the case?
Partly based on legal advice. Christian's lawyer didn't think anything productive would come from giving Corporal Cheney an explanation. But also,
she had decided to go ahead with the case without speaking with me first. I was dealing with somebody who wasn't willing to hear my side of the story.
Corporal Cheney, on the other hand, says,
I did want to talk to him. I wanted to hear his side of the story more than anything. I obviously gave him the opportunity to meet with me, even with his attorney, which I always did with people. I want to find out if people such as a victim, the girlfriend, I want to make sure that, hey, she's telling me the truth. I wanted to get his side of the story, but like I said, he didn't want to talk to me about any of it. I'd love to have had that conversation with him. You can't make somebody talk to you, and you can't be too careful either, especially with someone in his position. I completely get it. I understand that anybody in a law enforcement position, they can definitely be intimidating at times, but by no means or at any point in time was I ever threatening towards him or disrespectful towards him or any of that. Basically, I just asked him if he'd like to talk to me about it, and he he lawyered up on me right away before I could even explain myself or try to get any kind of questions answered.
In the last episode, we shared mostly Andrea's point of view from a long series of text exchanges between her and Christian, when they'd both been advised to cut contact. Now we're going to revisit that same period more from Christian's point of view, to hear how he responded, what he was telling Andrea, and how he was feeling.
At this point, Christian is all alone. His life as he knows it is gone, and he doesn't know why.
On December 1st, 2018, the day after he is officially charged, he texts Andrea saying, "I'd really love to know where we stand. I just need to know if you've left for good or if you saying you love me means you plan on coming back one day. I still want to be with you despite all this. I think this was really blown out of proportion and that it harmed me in ways you can't even understand. This was the most painful experience of my life, and I've never been treated with such malice and hatred before. I don't know if it's your mom holding something over you or if you just had a really, really good reason to do it on your own. But the experience nearly drove me over the edge several times. I've loved you with all my heart every day for the last 4 years. Having to get out of bed every morning knowing that the two living things that mattered most in my life were gone and thought I was a complete monster has made me so completely and totally devastated. And despite how much I've loved you, I haven't got so much as a vague note. After all this, I wish you could give me the benefit of the doubt or even listen to my side of this. But I'm hoping to God that there's something deeper going on here, something I just can't understand until someone gives me all the facts. Because I absolutely refuse to believe that the love of my life would do something like this to me without having a really, really good reason. I understand that you either don't want to or can't talk to me, but I need to know if you don't plan on coming back. I'll have to get a roommate to help with the rent."
Seeking comfort, Christian adopts another cat, Charlie. Andrea promptly reports this to animal law enforcement after seeing photos of Charlie on Instagram, giving Christian yet another thing to fear.
I was really scared because I thought they were going to take my first cat, Charlie. I just didn't want them to take the cat I had just got.
By the way, Christian getting a new cat isn't illegal in any way. The only way Christian or anyone would be barred from getting a new pet would be with a felony-level aggravated animal cruelty conviction.
On December 9th, Andrea starts texting Christian again, after more than a week of silence, asking how he's doing. He replies, "I am still living a nightmare. I sleep horrible every night, and my back hurts from sleeping on the couch." He says her leaving him during the final week of the semester dropped each of his grades severely. He had to go out and buy new furniture, plates, and cookware. He texts, "Not to mention saying you weren't leaving me and then leaving me anyway while I'm gone, so I have to come back to the horror that is my empty apartment. I never even got to say goodbye. I never even got to know what this means for us. I just wish I could understand all of it."
Andrea tells him law enforcement was going to take Storm if she didn't leave. He replies, "That's insane. I can't believe that's why this happened. They just let you keep Storm even though they thought she showed signs of abuse."
On December 14th, Christian, still trying to understand why Andrea left, asks, "Law enforcement forced you to permanently move out of the apartment, leave your fiancé behind completely, move to a different state, and sign yourself off the lease?"
Her reply, literally yes.
"I don't understand why they let you keep her," he says. "Somehow you're completely exonerated and I get witch hunted instead?"
On December 15th, in response to the photo of Storm Andrea shares, Christian says, "It makes me so happy just to see her face again. Thank you for letting me see how she's doing." Because of their ongoing text conversations, Christian remains hopeful they can still be together once the case is over.
We shared an exchange from January 29th in the last episode, where Andrea told Christian that she loved him since the day she met him, and she thought they'd figure things out. In that same exchange, he says, "Us staying together would mean defying our parents and possibly having to make some rash decisions. I'd give anything to have things the way they were. What I want is to love you for the rest of my life. That's all there is to say."
For the next few weeks, Christian continues to express his willingness to do whatever Andrea wants for him to salvage their relationship. But after his court date on February 21st, something changes for him. Andrea asks him how the court appearance went. He says not great. They're giving him horrible options on how to proceed, and there'll be another court date on April 4th. He texts, "My choices are either to let it go to trial and drag it out, or pretend I'm guilty so they can just put it on my record. It just keeps going on and on forever, and it's stressing me out so much. A lot has been put in perspective for me. I realize how much is standing between us. We're just so different, with completely different goals, beliefs, and needs. You deserve someone who makes you happy.
Christian tells us this was a breakup message for him, that this is the point he decided to move on.
She decided that I wasn't important enough to stick with through that. I, decided that she didn't care as much as I did.
Roughly 3 months pass until Christian reaches out again to ask Andrea how she's doing. And as we heard at the top of this episode, he's finally going to reveal to her what happened to Storm.
Their exchange begins with Christian shouldering some blame for being emotionally absent during the relationship. But he also shares that he feels betrayed by her leaving and for calling ALE when he got a new cat.
She asks why he's telling her all this. He says he's trying to give her peace of mind, that things weren't always bad, and he wants her to be happy. She replies that she's moved on and doesn't see them being friends in the future. He says he's being as nice as he can be about this, but her attitude really bugs him.
He says, "I've been nothing but forgiving after everything you did. You moved out without a word, hastily made statements in a police report, and called them again when I got a new cat. You betrayed me in every sense of the word. You put someone who stuck by you and loved you for 4 years through absolute hell."
It's after this that he tells her his version of what happened to Storm. A few days later, on June 4th, 2019, the investigator with the district attorney's office reports Andrea forwarding text messages from Christian, where he tells her Storm fell off the balcony.
Until Christian decided to tell Andrea what happened to Storm, there was no evidence he had anything to do with her injuries, other than the fact that he was home alone with her when they were discovered. Remember, the ER vets who examined Storm said the injuries could be caused by any number of things. And there was that stocking holder and vase Andrea noticed on the ground before she left home that day. So why take such a huge risk, going against legal advice, and tell Andrea he did know what happened to Storm after so many months?
He tells us it was killing him inside, that she thought he was some horrible monster.
It made me regularly sick to my stomach. I couldn't sleep. It was life-changing and probably the worst thing I've ever been through in my life. The feeling of being branded as something that awful.
It's not against the law to lie to your fiancé, but it certainly doesn't look good. And by telling Andrea what happened, even though he claims it was an accident, Christian damaged his credibility.
Both Corporal Cheney and Andrea have credibility problems as well. Everything we raised in the past few episodes, inconsistencies and discrepancies, they would surely look problematic under smart scrutiny in court. The vet statements alone contradict Corporal Cheney's affidavit.
And as you've heard in this episode, Christian has a plausible story that he's standing by as the truth, with no evidence documented anywhere that he's aggressive or intentionally harmed the cat.
Right. So with all this seemingly working in his favor, why in the world does he plead guilty on July 17, 2019, to a Class 1 misdemeanor for cruelty to animals?
Next episode, Christian in court. We examine the pressure on defendants to plead to crimes they didn't commit. We also explore how autism impacts criminal justice outcomes and hear expert opinions on how to create a better system.
Uncertainty for people on the spectrum is so overwhelming, so I can see why people plea. Pleading is the lesser of two evils because then it ends.
It really does come down to, does the judge, does the prosecutor, does the defense attorney know someone with autism? Do they have any familiarity with it? Do they have an appreciation for how this impacted what happened or the person's response after they came in contact with the system? One of the things we were concerned about and Christian was concerned about was a jury, because you just never know how they're going to take the information. Christian lied to his girlfriend. People automatically, will make assumptions.
The guilty knowledge, I think, is pretty, consciousness of guilt type of behavior by the defendant is really, to me, what's most telling. The way he kind of blew off the girlfriend, that just to me is like, yeah, this guy should have known better.
Vulnerable Creatures is written, directed, and hosted by Lauren Hugg and Matthew Schnipper, and produced by Vehement Visuals in Colorado Springs. Voice actors in this episode are Angie Glenmore, Michael Johnson, and Lauren Kunze. Original music by Michael Johnson and Dave Pastor. Logo design by Ryan Hannigan. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters.
Every time